but it's a nice idea if I was.
Okay, so it looks like we're live. Hello to anyone who's tuning in right now. I don't know how many folks we have. We're going to put a link in the chat to the sign in. So first things first, make sure you sign in. And there's a space where you can ask questions if you already have some. And if questions come up later, you can put them in the YouTube chat and we will see them and ask them. We'll get started officially in just a moment. Ariana, would you mind turning your camera on, at least for introductions?
Hi.
Hi. All right, we've already got some students signing in. That is awesome. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our Career Ask Me Anything series. As you may know, this is an opportunity to learn what it's really like to have some pretty cool tech jobs, and you have the opportunity to ask our guests anything that you are curious about what their job is like and how they learned what they know, and yeah, their background and things like that. So today we have a really amazing guest. She's a senior manager of products at Etsy, Eve Ahearn. So Eve, and also I want to introduce Ariana Smallwood, who's here as our student representative. So she'll be reading some of your questions that you put in the chat and also in the YouTube comments. So anyway, welcome Eve, and thank you so much for being here.
Sure. So I'm just going to talk for a few minutes about what it is I do as a product manager at Etsy and how I got to have this role. And then I look forward to answering any questions about the job or how I happened to get this job or anything else that I can answer. Cool. So I am a product manager, as mentioned, at Etsy. For those not familiar or with the role product manager, what that means is I serve kind of as the meeting point, let's say, between lots of parts of a team and a software development team. So I work with design, I work with research, I work with analytics, and I work with software engineers. And my main job is to get all of those people to work together well to build great things for customers now at Etsy. And so my role in a day-to-day can mean lots of different things depending on what part of the cycle of building something we're in. It can mean talking to customers, running data analysis, working with designers on different possibilities, or working with engineers to figure out how to break up these big ideas into concrete tasks that we can kind of work through as a group. At Etsy specifically, I work on making the site work better for our customers outside of the US. And I've been at the company for about a year, maybe 10 months or so. Immediately before this, I got to work in Germany for a year at an e-commerce company also there, a German e-commerce company called Zalando. And I had a same role working for different kind of customers on different kinds of projects. I was also a project manager there. And earlier in my career, I worked as a product manager at several data startups in New York. And I also did some very different other things. Like my first job out of college was I worked as a high school teacher in Panama City, Panama. which was a lot of fun. I like living in new places, which is why I wanted to go to Germany and wanted to go to Panama. Yeah, let me see other good introductory information. I thought about how to make all of my different jobs in a series sound coherent. And I couldn't really figure out a good way to do that because they're not really. But I would say that in each of them, I had something that made me interested really in each specific role and something that I really wanted to learn and why I hoped a reason why I thought that that role would help me learn that thing. And they each led into the next one, even if looking back over the last 10 years of my career, they don't necessarily make sense that I had all of these different things. So for example, I mentioned that I wanted to move to Panama after college, mostly just because I wanted to travel and I couldn't afford to travel without working. So I thought, okay, I'll just travel. I'll just travel by working elsewhere, which was nice. And then I had known at the time that I was interested in, I had studied political science in undergrad, but I had known that I was interested in technology. And I thought the best way at the time, because I thought that I wanted to do technology policy stuff. And so I thought the best way to learn would be to get a job at a tech company. And I did that at a place, the only place I could find really that would hire somebody who had no technical background. And while there, I looked around and realized like what I thought. I realized that I was actually interested in working in tech and not just in tech policy. Like I thought that it was all to go back to work to go to work in government. I thought I was actually interested in working in technology and looked around an organization and tried to figure out whose job seemed most interesting and how I could kind of learn from my coworkers. And so at the time, right out of college, I didn't know. In my job now, I do use some, I do have some kinds of programming skills and do use that in my day-to-day to some degree. Or in different of my jobs as a product manager, but that's not something I had at the start of my career. I had taken one computer science class previously, and it was not something I thought I was particularly interested in or liked, but once I realized that I liked working in tech and that some of the more interesting jobs required coding, I convinced one of my coworkers who was a software engineer to offer classes to me and some of my other coworkers who seemed interested, and we started learning like at the end of the day at work. And then I started taking classes outside, first at like a community space. And then I took classes at CUNY, at Baruch in programming and at Baruch, and then at NYU, like community college classes, and was able to learn a lot that way and move into other roles. So again, it was not part of like a big plan. It was just each thing, I was learning the next thing that I needed to do to do the thing that I thought seemed most interesting. Let me see something else that I can say that is a good, helpful introduction. I would also say, in thinking back as my role, so I mentioned I've worked now as a product manager at 3 companies. One company I worked at sort of doing similar work, but with a different title. And I would say, I think it's a job that is really fun and very interesting, but it's a job that's very different depending on the company and requires really different skills and also looks really different in a day-to-day way. And for me, that's a positive of it, but it also is something that makes it harder when I've talked to people in the past about wanting to get into this as a role, because it just can mean super different things. Being a product manager at a company that's making hardware looks really different than a company that's making a website. Working as a product manager at a company that makes educational software, for example, software for teachers, it's really awesome to have experience as a teacher. We're working, I worked when I was working at this e-commerce company, I became friends with this person who's a product manager at a company that made basically like artificial intelligence related software for fashion. So the company was basically like helping identify types and categorize types of clothes for clothing companies online. And this person that I became friends with had previously worked as a buyer at a fashion company. She didn't have a technical background, but she knew a lot about fashion and buying and the whole cycle of that. And she was really awesome at her job because she had that experience. And so, but of course, somebody who's wanting to make educational software or some kind of hardware, having that fashion buying experience won't be the same benefit as a product manager, and the job will look really different. And so, again, that's something to me that I think is exciting about the role, because it means I feel like I can take the same kind of skills and work in some different kinds of move into different kinds of industries and keep learning new things that way. But it does make it, I think, more challenging when you're trying to think about like wanting to think about this as a role in the abstract, or wanting to become a product manager in abstract. And so my last thing on that note is that, so in my own personal experience, I also worked, as I mentioned, I worked at some data startups as a product manager in New York. And there, I did that because I was really interested in data and very interested in open data. And that role was much more technical, actually, than my role currently at Etsy. Though I think my current role is challenging and interesting in other ways. Yeah, that was a not very organized summary of my career, but hopefully that was helpful. And I can talk further about any of those particular parts or start to answer questions if people have them.
Yeah, we actually already have quite a few student questions.
Cool.
So maybe we can jump into those, and then, but yeah, I think this is a great start.
Okay, one of the questions are, what did you major in college?
I majored in political science. Yeah. And I would say I mean, on one hand, it's not something that I use every day in my career. On the other hand, I feel like from this job that I have, and probably for a lot of jobs, a lot of the skills, a lot of my job is communication between different parts of the company and figuring out how to create a narrative out of really disparate feeling pieces of information, and how to think about how to communicate well between really different groups of people. And I think some kind of generic skills that I learned from that major, as just like what I think skills that you might learn in any liberal arts major, I do use a lot in my job, even though I'm not actually working on like policy issues. And maybe at some point, I do have a long-term dream. I still want to work in government. Hopefully I grew up in New York. I would love to work for the New York City government at some point, maybe doing like IT stuff. So yeah, maybe in the future.
That's really cool. Did you mention where you studied?
No, I didn't. Sorry. I went to Dartmouth College in New Hampshire.
Very cool.
I also think, looking back, that I think if I was in college now, I didn't take any computer science classes in college. Honestly, it didn't occur to me. I think a lot has changed since I was in school. I think now I probably I wish I had taken some more instead of taking them, as I mentioned, in like CUNY or something after college. I would have liked to have done that at the time. It just, I didn't think about it. I didn't know anyone who worked in tech, and it didn't occur to me that I might want to.
It looks like there's another question. If Etsy is a selling website, what are the products that you're managing?
Yeah. So the website itself. So if you think about Etsy, Etsy is a marketplace, a two-sided marketplace. Like eBay, let's say, is another example. And so when I talk about working on Etsy, we're thinking about how do we make the site a really awesome place for a seller, and also a really awesome place as a buyer. And sometimes that might be in working on changes that impact both of those experiences at once and ideally improve them. Or sometimes it might mean working on things that a good way to make life easier as a seller is to get there to be more buyers who want to buy your things, whatever it is you're selling. So sometimes it might be just working on the buyer side. But Etsy as a company, the product is basically the website, the apps. I don't work on the apps, I work on the website, and I work across the buyer and seller experience focused on international. So primarily more on the buyer than the seller side. So think about how do you, we're dealing with customers all around the world who use different languages, different currencies, different ways of writing dates or numbers or different things. And how do you make I think one of the great things about Etsy is that it's a global marketplace. You can buy from anyone worldwide, and you can also sell to people around the world. But it takes a lot of work to make that experience smooth on both the buyer and seller side. So I can talk about more specifics of that if people are interested.
That's great. Ariana, do you see another question to ask?
Oh, yes. What is the best way to get experience?
Yeah, I don't think I know an answer that's a general one, so I'll use my own specific life and try, and hopefully that will be helpful. I think that what I found is that it has been easier to start in your career, or in my own experience, it was easier to start in a startup than it would be to start in a big company. I think because in a big company, like a company like Etsy, say, roles tend to be a lot more specialized, and it's a lot harder. You still can move a little bit internally, but it tends to be harder. Versus if you're at a smaller company, things tend to be a lot more fluid, and people are a lot more willing to take a chance on you to try something new and willing to teach you to do something if you express interest in doing that. So my first two jobs in the tech space were both startups, and at both of them, I started when the company, I think the first one was maybe 50 people when I started, and I left when it was 120. And the second one was maybe 25 people when I started, and I left when it was maybe 100. So in both cases, I got to grow and change my role quite a bit as the company grew. And they were much more willing to, if I said, hey, I think I want to be a product manager, they were much more willing to take the chance on me and help me transition into that role, versus if I had just been applying cold to companies with no, traditionally product managers have either a business degree or a computer science degree or a design background, and I don't have any of those things. So it was a lot harder for, I think it would have been a lot harder for me to break into that role without going up through a smaller company. So that could mean like taking a role in another department and trying to you don't want to say to people when you start, hey, I only want to do this role for 3 months, because people don't tend to want to train you to do that. But I think it's okay once you're to say in an interview process, and once you're there, to say, hey, my long-term goal is to do this. I'm hoping by being here, I can learn things about that. And maybe then you'll be at a place that can help you work towards that. I think the other thing in terms of learning while on the job certainly is taking or getting a first role, certainly is working on projects independently really helps. That's things I did at different points in my career, but whether that's a website, I've worked on websites on my own or with other people, and that can help show to people, let's say, even if you haven't built a website for a company, that you can, the parts involved. And so maybe if you have, if working on design is interesting to you, for example, think about your favorite app and how you might redesign it or change its design. Or even if you're interviewing at a place, do it for that place. And that gives you good material to talk about in an interview, even if you can't talk about the design work you did at a previous job, for example. And so to extend that further, for any place that I apply as a product manager, for example, for this job at Etsy, I will spend time before the interview thinking critically about what is it that this business is trying to do, and what ideas could I bring? If I was working there as a product manager, what changes would I want to try to make, and why would it make sense to make them? And then it also gives you something to talk about in the conversations.
That's great. Thank you. We have someone from Canva asking what your favorite part of your job is.
Yeah, I really like working with other people. And so I really like that I have a job where I get to, as I mentioned, like I have an engineering team that I work with. I have a designer that I work with. I have a researcher and analyst, and I'm working with a lot of the other product teams. So I'm talking to different people in different ways all day. And for me, that's a lot of fun. And I know for some people, that's less fun. I think the downside is that there's very little that I do at work that's just me alone. Like I can say, I did this thing and that was only me, and that's it. On the other hand, yeah, I just think it's fun talking to people, getting to know people, feeling like I'm part of a team, and getting that whole team to feel like we're working towards something that's exciting. And yeah, I like that part. I think the other thing that's my favorite part, aside from getting to work with lots of people or interact with people all day, is I like getting to work on really different kinds of things. As I mentioned, my job is not every day is really different. Or at least there's a few different types of things that I might do in any given day. And a week is made up of days that are those different kinds of things. And that is fun for me. I think I would be less interested in doing the same thing every day, but I guess a lot of people would say the same.
Ariana, do you have a question?
Oh, yes, I have another question. Who or what inspires you to purchase a job in the technology field?
I don't think there is an individual person that I was looking at whose like career I was trying to copy in technology. I read an article, actually, I read an article in college, while I was in college, about, as I mentioned, I studied computer science, and I read an article about the founding of Cyber Command. This is really weird because I am not really that interested in military things, but I read this article about the Department of Defense at the time, this maybe like 2008, was creating this thing called Cyber Command, which was like basically they were saying like we need to think about war in space, in cyberspace, and found this department to do that. And I read it and was like, that seems crazy. I want to learn more about like what it is, not because I wanted to fight wars in cyberspace or because I don't know. This is a strange answer, but this is true. I just became really interested in that. And at the time I tried to I wanted to do like I was maybe a junior in college and I wanted to do my senior thesis on this, and it was too late for me. And I tried to study it's too late to submit an idea for a senior thesis. And I tried to do an independent study on this. And my professor I was closest to in college told me that I couldn't study issues related to technology policy without a computer science background, which now I actually don't think is true, but that's what he told me. And he said, I don't think you could do interesting research on this because you don't know anything about computer science and you don't understand this background. And I think I'm very motivated generally by people telling me I can't do something. And so I thought that I read this article, I was really interested in it. I don't know what about this article made me so interested in, but whatever. And this professor told me this, and I thought, well, I'll show him. I'm going to learn a lot about technology. And first I wanted to live in someplace new, and I worked in Panama. But when I came back to New York, I thought, I want to work at a tech company. I don't really care what I do or what I just want to work at a tech company, and that's how I'm going to learn. And I don't really care what I do in that first role. And well, I never got to study this thing, so I don't know if that really worked out or didn't work out, but I do like the career I ended up with.
I think that's a really good thing to hear, though, is that, you know, if you read something, it can be just an article and something really strikes you, that can be a good indicator, not that you'll do that exact thing, but that's something to follow. And also the attitude of like, well, if I want to work in a big tech company, I'll start anywhere and like learn what I want to learn is also, you know, people think they have to have the exact perfect qualifications for the before starting, but you know.
And I would say in general, like all of my roles that basically everything in my career has happened because I became really interested in like kind of a random seeming thing and pursued it strongly. And it mostly has taken me to unexpected places. But so to give another example of that, when I was the first company that I ended up working with was this company called RelSci. And I ended up working on this data team, and I didn't know anything about data, and I didn't really particularly care about data. What I cared about was doing technical policy research and showing my professor up. But I became really interested in data while I was there, and there was a movement, this is like 2012 maybe, there was a movement around this concept of open data, government open data, and I became really interested in that and started going to like events in the city. A lot of cities like New York were opening government data sets for the first time, like restaurant inspections or building permits or things like that. And at the time, I'm more cynical about this now, but at the time there was like really, it felt like this could be a part of like a big change in how government is done. And I became really interested in that and was like, this is my new idea. I'm going to go to grad school. I found this researcher whose work I was really interested in. I'm like, I'm going to go to grad school and do my thesis on this. And I did end up doing that. And I thought maybe I would continue and get a PhD on data policy, or again, like go work in government on open data policy. And what ended up happening was I met somebody who introduced me to a company that was in New York that was working on open data. It was a company, but they were building things for using government open data. And that ended up being my first product manager job. So I moved back to New York and got that job. And so, and again, now, I mean, I don't work in open data anymore. It's not my driving factor, but that was like a real push for me in my career for a number of years. And again, like similar with this random article, this interest in open data like pushed me ahead from thing to thing. And then my interest changed again, and I am now interested in clothing and sustainability, and that's why I have the job I have now. So we'll see where that takes me next.
Oh, that's great. Ariana, do you see another question?
Yes. What essential skills do you think are important for product managers to have?
I think a few things. I think the first is communicating well. I mentioned that my first job was a teacher. I had worked a lot as a tutor throughout college and high school. And I think that taking a complex topic and trying to explain it to people is a really core, it's harder than it seems sometimes, and is a really core skill to my job because I'm translating between different teams all day long. So communication, or being able to break down complex topics. I think a second core skill is just critical thinking. I mean, that sounds really broad, but trying to think through patterns in things. So like what will, as a product manager, ideally the classic example is, you don't want to build exactly just what a person asks for. I think the example being like the Henry Ford example being that like people always are asking for faster horses. They're not asking for cars or something along those lines. So how can you think through critically, like what is it that people are really wanting, not hearing what they're saying, but also thinking through like what is the underlying need behind that. And I think then there's a few other like basic skills that are really helpful, like some degree of like statistical knowledge, analytical skills, math. This is not like my strongest suit, but it's something I think it's helpful to enjoy to some. I do like it to some degree, and it's helpful to enjoy and have some knowledge of. I think I mentioned technical skills, knowing how, if you're going to work on a website, for example, knowing how a website's work at a very high level is really helpful. And then last, I think just, I'll say two last things. One, subject matter expertise. As I mentioned, being a product manager in different industries really differs, and it's really helpful if you can be, you don't have to be, but if you could be a subject matter expert in the, like if you know what your customer, if you have some knowledge of who your customers are and what they need, that's really great. As I mentioned, the clothing company example. And then lastly, just as I mentioned, you're working with a lot of different kinds of people, so it helps to be able to get along with different kinds of people and think of that as a fun thing and not a chore.
Yeah, that's great. And that actually leads into a question from Lisa from the chat, which is, how has networking helped you in your career?
Definitely a lot. I would say, I think as I've moved throughout my career, my understanding of what networking is has really changed. I think I remember when I was in college, I really hated networking. I hated the idea of networking. It felt to me really phony and like hard. It's just not something I felt good at, like to go to events with people who seemed bigger or more important and try to impress them or something like that. I felt like I didn't know what it was. And I think, or it just felt uncomfortable to me, let's say. And I think, and the times that I tried it, I mostly failed at it. I think what I learned, like especially with this first job that I mentioned back in New York, is that traditionally when you hear about networking, it's about meeting people who are a level above you and trying to impress them and get them to help you. But that in my career has not been how it's been helpful. It's been all about getting to know peers and like building real relationships with them and building kind of like a community around what I'm interested in and figuring out how we can help each other. So I mentioned like the first really important helpful thing was like my colleague at RelSci who wanted to teach me how to program. Like that was awesome. And not just him, it was my like 6 other colleagues who also, we had classes every week together and who were also interested in learning, and that we were able to organize that. And like all of us, it changed all of our careers. Like that's been really awesome now looking back to see, but also at the time it felt like I wasn't alone. I didn't need to be embarrassed about not knowing things. We were doing things together, and actually in secret from our employer, which was a whole separate thing, who was not interested in us upskilling ourselves, which they really should have been, but that's a separate thing. So I think that I also mentioned that I started to go to these open data events. And when I started to go, I was really scared intimidated by everyone at them, because I felt like everyone knew things that I didn't know, which was probably true. And I also felt like it was like me feeling like I needed to impress people who knew more than me without knowing anything. And again, that's wrong. It was more just like what is valuable about them in retrospect was that I went and listened and got excited heard about new directions and got excited about them, and heard about, like, for example, this graduate program in England called was at Oxford, called the Oxford Internet Institute, that I ended up attending. Like I heard about that through these kinds of events that I started going to. And I made friends then that I still have now, and I've continued to cross paths with in different ways. Actually, a lot of people, I presented a project that I worked on. I made a browser extension for Mozilla, the Firefox browser, last year, and I presented it at this conference that the Mozilla organization has last year. And it was really nice because a lot of these friends from this open data events were at this conference, I don't know, 9 years later. And so I think, again, like what I think about when I think about networking now, and what I wish I had known then, is that it's not about trying to like only go up, though sometimes it's helpful. Like, you know, you can email people and ask them, and sometimes they'll be more helpful than you might expect. And I'm also, if any of you want to email me, I'm happy to talk further. but like thinking through how you can build community, like make real friends that are interested in the things that you're interested in work-wise, and how you can learn from each other. And I'm now part of a number of like groups, different product manager groups, for example, where people share tips about their jobs, about resumes, about interviews, and that continues to be helpful. And I also think of it as a place where I now have friends. My friends in my general life don't all care about product management, but that's fine. That's why I have this like other group. Yeah.
That's great, thanks. Ariana, do you want to see more questions?
Oh, yes. What ideas how do you suppose new ideas to improve a company's efficiency?
Efficiency. There we go. So how do you propose new ideas to improve your company's efficiency? That's a good
a few different ways, but I think in a really general way, like one thing that I would really actually recommend, this is a very boring suggestion, but a genuine one, I would recommend for anyone interested in product management or interested in product management at a specific company is, if that company happens, generally reading everything that they have out there about what it is they're trying to do and why they think it works. And then second, if they're a public company, reading their filings and their annual reports, because they are telling their investors what they're trying to do and why they think that's a good idea. And it's really helpful. Sometimes can be dry depending on the company, but it's really helpful. And so I think going back to the specific question around improving efficiency, it's important to know like how does the company make money, and what are they trying to do? What are the current problems with their business model? So for like a generic, like for any kind of marketplace, for example, you need both buyers and you need sellers. Like if you're Uber, you need drivers and you need riders. And so you have to think about like, what is the current problems with the model? Do you have too much of one or too much of the other? Is it that buyers are not able to find the things they need? Is it that sellers are having a difficult time, I don't know, advertising themselves or listing their products or something like that? So it's hard to say in a generic way. I think the overall advice is just to like think clearly about, or try to think down, and I'll even write this down to myself when I'm like thinking about trying to interview for a job or think through a company, is to think about like, how does this company make money? Sometimes it can be harder than you might expect or more complicated than you might expect. And like, what are the potential opportunities for each of those areas? So not like becoming more efficient. It's hard to think through like something becoming more efficient or just like more profitable or what have you in a really generic way. It's easier if you think about like what the current path is, and then think about what if we just made part A better, and what would it mean for it to be better? And then once you have an idea of like what it means for that part to be more efficient or better in some way, then you can start to think through ideas about how to do that. And I also will look a lot of times at like competitor, what are similar companies doing similar things, and if they're making different decisions for how they do a certain thing, think through like, how does it impact all of this parts of the process for that thing to be different? And is that better than what this first company is doing, and what have you?
Cool. So you've kind of mentioned a lot of, different moves that you've made.
Yes.
But is there one thing that you think is the best career decision you ever made? That's from the chat.
Yeah, definitely, 100%. I would say the first job that was really helpful in me getting started, but I think they were also not helpful, as I mentioned, because they didn't want us to learn programming. I think the best career move I made was the job I took after grad school at this data company called Enigma. And I think The reason why was not so much even what the company did or what my job was at the time, but just that I really connect. I had the same boss my whole time there. We really got along. He really felt like he had my best interests in mind. And like when I said, hey, I want to be a product manager, like for example, I said I wanted to be a product manager, he helped me do that. And I think, I mean, listen, I've had many bosses. I'm sure everyone here has had bosses that are less helpful than that. And so I found like for that specific job, working with a team that felt supportive, that I felt like I clicked with in some kind of way, was in some ways more important ultimately than the specific thing that we're working on, because I was able to learn so much by having like really open communication with my boss. So for example, he does have an MBA. As I mentioned, I do not. So I was able to ask him a lot about like what he had learned from that. I mean, learn from that as it applied to like the things that he was working on, like how is he thinking through certain problems, and it felt like I was able to learn a lot by proxy from that. And also he even, and other people at the company like introduced me to other people that they thought I could get along with, like in the industry, and could learn, again, like learn with or be friends with or something like that. And it really made me feel for the first time that I like really belonged, or really had, like I felt at home in my career. I don't know, in a way that I didn't feel when I was at this previous job that I was mentioning. It felt like, I mean, I literally was like clandestinely learning things with my coworkers, and it didn't feel like my boss did not have my best interest in mind. He didn't really know me. He didn't really care what I wanted to do. And yeah, I'm glad that I had that job, because it started off the rest of my career, but I'm glad I didn't stay any longer than I did, because I think it would have been really hard to grow any further there.
I definitely think that's good advice, that no matter where you're working, you know, you don't want to do anything wrong by your company, but you should put your needs and your like interests first, because it's your life.
Yeah, definitely. And also just that, like, again, I think it can be cool to work at a cool company whose products you use and you know, but it's much better to work at a place where you feel like the manager is supportive of you and they're interested in you growing and learning, in my career at least.
That's great. So we've actually had two different people asking about more details about what are the day-to-day kind of tasks? And I know you it changes with the cycles, but.
Yeah, definitely. So let me go through them and think of a good way to organize them. Okay, so on the engineering side, as I mentioned, I work with an engineering team in different jobs. The size of the engineering team has varied from like the very small end, maybe 3 engineers, to as big as 10 engineers. My current team is 5. Part of my job is deciding what they work on. And so what we do that somewhat collaboratively. So we have what it's called so we use this type of development called agile development. You might have heard of this. It's very common among software engineering currently. So every 2 weeks, we plan what we're working on for the next 2 weeks. And we also have a meeting where we talk about what went well and didn't go well in the previous 2 weeks. And we also have a session where we share out to other teams, like my manager and other people, what we've done in that time. So part of my day, every day, is syncing with the engineering team. We do stand up either virtually or like over Slack. I guess everything to some degree is virtual, but in a video call or over Slack every day. Around like what they're working on and the problems that they faced in those tasks. So maybe something that they tried to do turns out to be significantly harder than they expected, or they've come up with an idea that would be much easier, or they've discovered this bug that they think we should fix, or they have discovered this great improvement, this efficiency improvement, or what have you, that they think that we should work on later. So part of my job every day is interacting with engineers and different software engineers in different kinds of ways. I'm also, as I mentioned, working closely day to day with the designer, and I would say through and an engineering manager, and we're working together on the what of we should build. Like, what are these engineers working on? And through that, also part of my job every day is the why. So, before we know that we want to make this, let's say the engineer has a ticket. We use Jira for our project management tool. I think that's pretty common. The software engineer might have this ticket that says, make start button green instead of blue. And the designer had a design for that, the color green that it should be. But we first have to have some ideas to why is it better for that button to be green? We're not actually just going around changing buttons, but just as I think it is an example. So part of my job also is either doing analysis myself or working with an analyst that I work with to look through data on customer interaction with the site that we've made. So maybe we notice that nobody is clicking this button that we added that we thought was going to be really popular because it says click here to get 10% off or something. And we think, maybe no one's noticing it. Or we just notice that no one is noticing it. So part of it is combing through data every day to figure out what patterns can I notice in how people are either using the site in problems in how people are using the site. And then another part of it is user research. So actually talking to buyers or sellers, let's say for Etsy. I don't do that every day, but I do it maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks to see, okay, we'll show them the button. Would you click on this, yes or no? And then we try to understand why, if not, we thought this button was going to be so helpful. If not, why not? And maybe they say, oh, I didn't notice it because of the color. And then we're like, oh, maybe we should change the color or something like that. And I think to some degree, also part of my day every day is just trying to stay on top of the field of technology more broadly is changing all the time. So trying to I read newsletters, I look at other websites to try to understand what patterns am I noticing that we should adopt, or what new technology is emerging that we could maybe use. So from that, let's say competitive research or just understanding the kind of landscape that I'm working in, from the data analysis, from the research, trying to synthesize that all into the changes that we're trying to do. And more importantly, why are we trying to do those changes and what thing does it hope to drive for the business? I think the other thing that's different working in a larger company like Etsy now compared to previous jobs is there's also a lot more just in a day-to-day way interfacing with other teams. So let's say in previous roles, maybe I was working on a piece of software where my team was the only team making changes to it. So we didn't have to tell anyone really, except for our customers, that, hey, this great change is coming, that's great, look out for it. Whereas at Etsy, there are maybe, let's say 50 teams that are all making changes on the same website at the same time. And we have different lanes to hope that there's not conflict, but also part of my day is chatting to people in those different teams, hey, what are you trying to do? Why are you trying to do that? That's interesting. Can we collaborate? Or maybe to say, oh, we shouldn't touch that button because you have plans to make it red tomorrow or something like that. So kind of coordination between teams and checking in is a larger part of my day. I think it's a larger part of the day in a larger organization because you inevitably have more conflicts between teams than it was when I was working at a startup. On the other hand, there's a lot more resources within the organization and people to learn from, where at a smaller company, you have to learn everything on your own. So that's harder in a different way.
Thank you for that. Ariana, do you have another one?
Oh, yes. Have you ever changed majors in college because I realized the path wasn't for you? I mean, that path wasn't for you. From Victoria Skinner.
Yes. Well, I changed my first year in college. I started college saying that I wanted to study history, and then I took a political science class and I really liked it, and I ended up studying political science, which in the end, I don't know if that really, maybe it did or didn't make a big difference in my career. I think a lot of the skills I learned in political science that I use at work, I would have learned in a history major. On the other hand, this whole like revenge trying to learn about tech policy, maybe I wouldn't have gotten started down that road, and I have no idea what I would have been doing if I, but I think ultimately, obviously it's really important. It is important what you study in school, but I think that there's a lot of jobs that can benefit from lots of different kinds of careers, as long as you're like, know that, okay, like learning is never going to stop when you go to, when you end of college, particularly in the world of tech where everything is changing quite quickly. So even if I had studied computer science in school, I would have still needed to learn things on the job afterwards anyway. And also I think as long as you can think about like, what is it that you did learn from that jobs, and how can you kind of try to sell it yourself, why your skills are right for a certain role. Because first to sell it to yourself, and then to hopefully sell it to the employer.
Great. You talked a little bit about this, but wondering how you've been able to travel as much as you did, like to study and also to work, how to find those opportunities.
Yeah. Kind of randomly, but mostly just because I was actively very looking for them. So I really I studied Spanish in college. I really liked it. I really wanted to travel in Latin America. As I mentioned, I knew, I was like, I can't spend 3 months traveling without working. So I thought I will try to get a job. And I looked, and this random small company in Panama City had posted a job on my college's job board, and I applied and got it. So that was kind of random. That was very small, but I mean, I was actively looking at the time, as I mentioned, to basically anything I could do that would pay me and I could live in Latin America. And teaching, I knew teaching, I taught actually history, funnily enough. I taught history for AP US and AP World History to high school students, and also the SAT and TOEFL, which I was sort of qualified for, sort of not, or mostly not maybe. But in any case, like this job was the only one really I had seen, but I was really looking for that. And I knew teaching was good, but I couldn't find, there are other programs for teaching, like Japan, the Japanese government, for example, has a great program for people to move there, Americans to move there and teach. And so does the Spanish government. But I wanted to be in Latin America, and I didn't know anything about Panama, but I saw a job there. And it ended up being really great. I actually met my husband there. I made a lot of friends. I love Panama. It was a good time, but it was not like a super strategic choice, other than that I knew that I wanted to travel. And I think same for grad school. What I was interested in, there weren't that many programs. Like for technology policy, there's basically like 3 programs, and 2 are in the US. Three programs, 3 main programs, and 2 are in the US and 1 is in the UK. And I only applied to the one in the UK because I thought, living in the UK, that's even better. I always want to live in new places. And I also, it's much less expensive to go to grad school in the UK. And I ended up, my job that I'd had in New York, I worked half-time actually for them while I was in the UK. So I was able to pay, I took out some loans for that, but I was able to pay a lot of it from working at the same time. And it's also only a year. So that seemed easier to commit to, because in the UK, grad school is only a year. Master's programs are only a year. And then afterwards, after I'd been working in New York for a few years, I really, again, wanted to live in a new place. And this time I was married and my husband also wanted to live in a new place. We wanted to do that together. And so I started looking for places that would hire me and pay for a visa for me to live somewhere else because I don't have another citizenship. And I knew that there are a few cities that have good technology industries, like outside the US, that have industries where you can, and also that you can get a visa to live in. And so Dublin, Stockholm, Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and Berlin. And I just, again, applied to a lot of places, and I only got a job in Berlin. And so we moved there, and it ended up being great. And I think that city, in retrospect, what is the best of those ones to live in for a few other reasons, but it wasn't also very strategic, other than that, like, I had decided a while in advance that this is something I wanted, and I talked about it again with this like peer group of people, like talking to anyone who I had worked abroad, like how they had done it. And also because I had gone to grad school in England, I did know some people that were working in Europe. So that also helped. But I did just like cold apply to the place I had gotten. Ended up, yeah.
That's very good advice. I mean, it is. And I think just to add to that, if you end up going to a college that has a study abroad program, it can seem kind of, if you like want to get some experience with that, in some cases it's actually cheaper to study abroad for a year than it is to stay, especially if you're in somewhere like New York. So
yeah, and especially if they also, depending on the school, you can do it through another school, and sometimes that can also decrease the cost. Yeah, I feel like in a lot of them, that once you're in a place, it's also more helpful. That's how you meet people. But I did just end up mostly get all of these things by cold applying, but by knowing that I really wanted to go abroad and that I was really flexible. Like with my first job, my dream initially was that I wanted to live in Mexico. I don't know, I like Mexican food. I'm not really sure why that was my dream, but I had studied in college actually in Mexico. So that is part of why it was. I loved Mexico. I wanted to go back there and I couldn't find a job. And I thought, okay, Panama is closer than the US. It ended up being, Panama is super different as a country. It ended up not being like Mexico at all, but it was still a good experience. And working abroad is, if it's difficult for you to travel, I would, like, as for me to pay for traveling, I would really recommend it.
Awesome. So we are about at time. I'll end with just the question of, if you have like one piece of advice to give to high school students right now who are interested in, you know, a lot of people like would never have even heard of a project manager as a career necessarily. So like a piece of advice for high schoolers to like learn more about the tech industry and how to get into it, what would that be?
I think you're already doing the right thing, and get an internship if at all possible, and be really flexible about like what you do in that internship, because as I mentioned, you can learn things from coworkers once you're already in a place. It's just hard to get your foot in the door for that first thing. And especially, again, that's true if it's a small company. So if you do sales at a 10-person company and there's probably one person who's a product manager, you'll be able to meet them and get to know what their job is like much easier than if you're at a 100-person company, or if you're a 1,000-person company, even if maybe that company seems cooler because they make something that you use. So I think working at smaller companies earlier in the career can be really awesome. I guess that is my first thing. And the only second thing that I would really underscore is, like, if you're in this program already with friends or meeting people, like staying in touch with them and thinking of them and that as like networking, and just as people who you're friends with that you talk about things that you're interested in career-wise, I think is the best other piece of advice. Because, you know, you can share that way, you can share opportunities that maybe you come across that don't feel right for you, but maybe is right for your friend, and vice versa. And share things that you're learning and make it more fun, as opposed to trying to make it feel like scary work. I don't know. Yeah, and just following things that seem interesting to you, even if you're not entirely sure how you'll use it at work. yet is good. Who knows what the world will look like in 20 years or what any of our careers will look like then. But I think if you keep learning, it'll hopefully work out.
Very true. Well, thank you so much. And for everyone whose questions we didn't get to, sorry, we tried to combine some of them and stuff. But if you have other questions, you can get in touch with us and maybe we can put you in touch with Eve.
Yeah, I'm also happy if people want to email me, if you can pass on my email, and I'm happy to talk to anyone and talk about job search or resume stuff or whatever.
Great. Then well, thank you so much. I just put your email address. I'll send it to Peizu, who'll put it in the chat maybe.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and expertise.
Yeah, hopefully it was helpful.
Yeah, I learned a lot. So, and guys, join us next week. We'll have another career AMA, same time, same different link, but we'll send it to you.
Okay.
Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of the evening.
Yeah.
Bye.